You wash my hands.
Okay, hello everyone. Good morning. We got the live stream going here, so we're all official. Okay, it's 9:51. Please don't tell anyone I'm almost following the rules now. I really don't want that reputation. We're going to let our live streamers get on here. As we begin, though, we have an announcement from New Song.
Yes.
And if you would just come sit here so everyone can see you.
All right. If you look in your worship folder this morning, you'll see that there's a New Song returns on September the 14th. New Song is a community choir made up of seniors. And our slogan, I guess, is what you call it. We're never too old to make a new friend or learn a new song. It's non-denominational, so you'll meet some people from other churches, and that's a lot of fun. You'll find some, when you do hymns, they've never sung them before. And you're going, okay. But it's, if you like to sing, it doesn't matter if you read music or not. Come join us. We start on September the 14th. At 9 o'clock, there'll be a brunch in here. And then at from 9:30 to 11, we meet in the Choral Hall on Wednesdays. Thank you.
On the second floor.
Any questions?
Right above here. Right here. Charlie, do you want to say something first?
I just want to say thanks to Joni, and she leaves. She's done our attendance box for 2 weeks.
Ah, thanks to
Richard
Joni.
Reed should be back next week, but thank you, Joni.
All right. Well, hey, Richard, online. We're used to seeing you right back here, and you're online today. I just happened to look down and see you say hello. By the way, Jim is keeping your seat warm right now. Well, you know it's well taken care of. Well, as we were coming in, someone said, "Oh, this is a big day," or "This is a sad day," and there's all sorts of emotions, right? All sorts of emotions. I told Allison this week the best way to deal with this is just to be jaundiced, which I am, which ministry will do to you. We're like, okay, yeah.
Easy come, easy go.
That sounds much more cavalier than I want to be, right? The reality is, and I was thinking about this week, I think one of the things that's very hard to understand, and Jim will testify to this, I think, as well, among others of you. When you have known and been part of people's lives for such a very long time in a congregational setting, it is hard to let that go. And you don't know how hard it is to let it go until you've let it go. Because the access to people's lives that you're afforded as a pastor, there is nothing close to that in the rest of life. The only thing that would even come close that I can think of is to be a doctor, to be so involved in medical decisions, but that's only one part of a person's life. And when you're a pastor, you're involved in the totality of people's lives, and not just their life, but their family lives and their community lives. And when you've been in a place 33 years, as George has, that's a lot of people that have passed through.
What should we do for him? Should we send him emails like once a month?
Yeah, let him know occasionally that you still care. Because, seriously, one of the hardest things for pastors who retire, and Jim, feel free to jump in here from your experience as well. One of the hardest things for pastors who retire, particularly after a long-term pastorate, is you go from being on all the time to not being on at all. And while that sounds great, it is great for a few weeks, maybe a few months. And it's not that your ego necessarily needs the stroke, but it's an adjustment, right? Right?
A huge adjustment. It even gets to the point where you miss the
Yeah, I mean, I miss committee meetings sometimes. Yeah.
Missed the meetings.
To jettison, move away from a group of people that you've loved and cared for
Yeah.
for many years.
So, as you think about George, yes.
One thing along this line, he will still have his Wilshire BC email as long as he's working with the residents.
Oh, so George is going to keep his church email address,
Because of working with.
working with the residents.
Yes.
Okay. So you can still be in touch with him, and I'm sure he would love to hear from you from time to time. Just make a note a month or so from now to maybe say, hey, I remember you. Love you, appreciate you, thank you for what you've done. Because particularly it's amazing how things move on. You know, life moves. And if any of you have ever left another job that you've been in a long time, whatever it is, it's shocking to know that life goes on without you.
It is.
Right? It is hurtful. And we think life can't happen without us there, right? Particularly those of us who are Enneagram 8s, like me. Like, how in the world can you survive without me and my brilliant ideas? But even though there's been the summer transition, today becomes official in this, and I think that's and for the church itself. My God, think about the amount of change we have been through as a congregation in just the last 2.5 to 3 years. My departure, certainly one part of that. COVID, huge part of that. Other people who've come and gone during this period. Staff changes that have happened. There will always be changes happening. When I think about all the people who've died over even the past 5 years, I mean, if you multiply that by 33, that's a lot of people, right? But we're ever moving, right? As much as we think we're stable, and as much as Joni is always going to be here, and Ann keeping things going with the history of things, there's always change for us. So I think if there's any takeaway I have from this, it's that we've got to be prepared to keep moving. Ann?
I remember the discussion before George was called at the little group in the chapel, and a lot of people were saying that he was much too young. You know, I got up and I said, well, to me, age doesn't have anything to do with wisdom and leadership.
I think it worked out okay,
I
Ann.
proved myself right.
Yeah. At least 80%. Yeah. Yes.
Do the associate pastors all stay on when a new one comes?
I think the answer to that is it depends on whatever works out,
Yeah.
right? I think you can anticipate that over the course of time there will be changes, of course. You can look at people's ages and figure that out. That there's going to be some change along the way.
But that's made such a difference in the transition.
Right. So we'll see. Lot up in the air. With that. So fingers crossed on everything. But we're now entering an official period where we're truly in an interim kind of situation. And Darren and Heather and Doug are even more responsible in this. I texted Doug last night before today's big day because I know he's the one who's orchestrating everything, and said, may the angels protect you today. Pulling off a day like today, which I've done before, is exhausting. It's just exhausting. So we'll see what all comes of this. But thank you for being here today. Enough of me rattling about this.
That was good.
Okay, I hope that's helpful. Someone invited us over for dinner, and I asked what we could bring, and they said yourself and stories. And I said, well, I've got lots of stories. You just have to, all you have to do is pull my chain and I'll tell you a story. So in our Bible Verses We Love series, which I'm loving doing this, I hope it's interesting to you. I made a decision this week that I'm going to try to alternate each week between an Old Testament verse and a New Testament verse, so that we get stuck. I mean, I did spend 3 weeks in one chapter of Romans, and I'm going to try not to do that again. So last week we had a Psalm 121, and so today I thought I would go to a New Testament favorite, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This was on your list. I did my little thing where I pulled out the card and I sifted through and I found one that seemed appropriate, and this one came up. Now, some of you who've been with us and have a memory, unlike I do sometimes, will remember that maybe 3 years ago or so, we did a walkthrough of 1 Corinthians and then 2 Corinthians. I don't remember when that was, but it was sometime before COVID that we did that, right? And so some of this may be a little familiar, and if you feel like I'm repeating myself, it's because you're remembering something from maybe 5 years ago. Good
Our
for you.
memories aren't that good.
And otherwise, if it's a new thought, fantastic. You'll just think this is new brilliance coming out. So I'm curious. So 1 Corinthians 13, I probably didn't even have to read it to you, right? Love is patient, love is kind. If I speak with the tongues of men and angels but have not love, I'm but a clanging cymbal, I'm a gong. We will read it in a minute. But I'm curious for some of you, what has been your connection to this beloved chapter of Scripture? How has it been meaningful to you sometime in life's journey? Anyone? Yeah.
My connection to it is actually on down in the, I guess 11, is that when it, no, it's a little bit before that, 9, where when we know only in part, we prophesy only in part, but when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. I don't like this version that much. I like and the mirror dimly. And
Right.
When I was a child, I thought as a child, I actually, this was a huge touchstone for me in therapy.
Oh.
When you come, if you've been in therapy, oftentimes you come with this baggage that you developed as a child,
Right.
to survive.
Right.
And I didn't have a horrible childhood, but there's,
We all have baggage.
yeah, and it's not working anymore. And
Yeah.
and that letting go of the whatever is holding you down, and that I used to say it a lot actually in therapy. I just thought it was such a great
Yeah.
metaphor for personal transition. I know it refers to other things.
Yeah. Well, so Susan, correct me if I say this wrong, but one of the great Freudian concepts, is it Freud, about the parent and child, that we act out of the child behavior or the parent behavior. There be voices in our head, right, that are telling us to do this or to do this, or to care or not to care, to be. Is that Freud?
Wingfield, great philosophy.
It's Freudfield. That's what it is. Yeah, it is Freudian, if nothing else. So thank you. That's a great note. How else has someone connected with 1 Corinthians 13? We tortured the best man at our wedding and made him memorize it to recite it at our wedding.
Yeah, I've had to recite it several times.
Right. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because we did this, but this passage is not about romantic love.
Right.
Side note, we'll get there. Yeah. Yeah. Logan?
If you study painting way back, the painters would use a black mirror and they'd stand with their work behind them and they'd look at it for shadows, and that's through a glass dimly, and all you see is the shadow. you don't really see.
Wow, okay, so Loda's saying that in past times, painters sometimes would use a black mirror to look in reflection at their work to see the shadows in it, and that's like the glass dimly. Was Lynette?
Well, I just, here we go. The last 4 years, I had to remember when I saw some people that I loved them. And I had to remember that, consciously make that decision. And I thought about how I talk about how important love is. And, oh, you have to love everybody, and if you don't, then you're, and I had to do that in order not to be a hypocrite. And it made me, these verses came to my mind over and over and over, more times than I care to admit. And I had to consciously think about that because of the anger that I felt towards so many things that happened over the last 4.5 years. It was hard. And when you do that, when you actually stop and actually think about loving somebody, no matter what, then it makes a difference. And I am grateful that God gave me those words and kept pounding it into me. I still ain't where I want to be, but I'm better.
Well, I really don't like that interpretation of this passage, but it's all correct. Yes.
From Henry Stone, recently 1 Corinthians 13 has been the passage I think of as a response to when someone says, love makes you do crazy things.
So Henry says that he thinks of this as a response to what you say when people say love makes you do crazy things. So this passage actually came up in a conversation I had this week, which is not really why I chose it. It's a convenient illustration. I was talking with a friend who is early mid-40s. Young person, yeah. Grew up in the Irving area was really unchurched, largely. But she was telling me the story about how she had a crush on the son of the pastor at this Pentecostal church in Irving back in the day, and she started going to the youth group. We were talking about how youth groups can be culty, cult-like, and she was recommending a podcast that, if you're interested, I'll tell you later. It's not for everyone because it's got a lot of foul language in it. But if you're into that sort of thing, I'll recommend the podcast to you.
With the foul language?
Foul language.
If you're interested in the foul language.
In case you don't hear enough.
Okay.
Yeah. So we were talking about this, and she started telling me this story about going. This is vintage youth group stuff. She one of the reasons she kept going to church was they had a trip to South Pottery Island every year, and a week-long trip, and she wanted to go on the trip. She was a senior in high school, and she didn't understand what it was really about. It really, if any of you know what Beach Reach is, it's an evangelistic effort at spring break on the beach, and she was part of this church's effort in Beach Reach, and she wasn't even a Christian. And suddenly she gets down there, she's expected to go evangelize to people on the beach for 2 hours every day. And all these other restrictive rules. And that was tough. But what got her was they would have a worship time every night with the youth group. And someone started speaking in tongues the first night. And scared her to death, right? Like she didn't know what was going on with this. And then a creepy youth minister, seeing she was uncomfortable, came and laid his hand on her and started praying for her out loud. And she was about to come out of the chair, right? long story short, she called her parents who drove from Irving to South Padre Island to get her and bring her out of this cult, right?
I guess that was the end of her romance.
I think the guy wasn't worth it, in that regard. And so we're talking about this whole thing, and I thought, this reminds me about the book of 1 Corinthians, because what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians, so much of the book is about the abuse of the Spirit, and about the abuse of spiritual gifts, and about seeking things that are lesser as if they are greater. And what she was being led to believe in this youth group as a senior high school was that speaking in tongues and these other things are the ultimate go-to, when what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, you read the whole book, is you should seek the greater gifts. And chapter 13, it's not the last chapter of the book, but it's near the end of the book, and it really is the culmination, in a way, it's the high point here of Paul's argument that love is the greatest gift. That if you can develop the spirit of love, it goes with everything, right? And so when he says, if I have the gift of prophecy but have not love, I am like a clanging cymbal or a gong. I am just noise. What I'm saying doesn't matter. And so with that in mind, let's take a look at the text, because I want you to think about, this is really the culmination of Paul's argument about what really does matter in the church. Because the church at Corinth was a big old fat mess. They were dissentious. They were in dissension with each other. There was conflict. There was competition. Things were not great. And Paul sounds familiar. Paul says to them, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. That's the setup to say, love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I've been fully known. And now, faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of these is love. There's so much here. This is like 5 sermons in one chapter, right? And what I want to do today is try to help us tie the knot to bring them together. Why are these things in this passage together? Again, the church at Corinth, all messed up. People are fighting with each other. They're clawing with each other. They're trying to have the best seat. They're trying to get the most attention all the way around. Everyone wants to be heard. And I can't help but think about so much of Christianity today, particularly everyone who thinks they alone have the right answer to everything. Now, sometimes you'll hear me talk about these people as Theo bros. That's one of my favorite terms.
Well, they like it.
Well, oh yeah, Theo bros are the smuggest so-and-sos you ever met in your life. Because they have absolute truth, absolute certainty. They know exactly what God's will is, not only for you, but for them. And it's the same thing. Well, except when it benefits them and not you. Then they're in favor of that. But they're not alone in this. There are all sorts of people who really are certain that doctrine trumps love. Here's the problem. Doctrine never trumps love. Never ever. If it does, it's bad doctrine. You heard it here in 1 Corinthians. If you live the life of Mother Teresa, or can pray like St. Francis, and you don't have love, you have nothing, he says. Nothing. And I think we have to measure our faith and our doctrine always by love. Is it loving? So, there's a phrase we hear often used more and more that I want to put it out there because it's incomplete, but it gets to this idea. I heard it used just this week. In case you've not noticed, there's been just a little bit of debate out there about the student loan forgiveness thing. Just near civil war over it, right? And a part of this is politicized, but part of it's theologized as well. And whatever your politics on there are, just set that aside. I don't want to talk about the politics of it today. I want to talk about the theology of it today. Because as I wrote in one piece, the Bible verses have been flying back and forth on this. And everyone has a Bible verse to quote about how you got to pay your debts. And then someone responds with the parable of the laborers. And everybody got paid the same at the end of the day, regardless of how they worked. Someone quotes another verse about being responsible with your life. And then someone else quotes the year of Jubilee, Leviticus 25, and God's intent for the children of Israel, that they never did, by the way, was to have debts forgiven every 7 years, and every 49 to 50 years, the 50th year, was to be a year of Jubilee when everything reset. And catch this, property goes back to its original owner. All debts are forgiven. It's a reset. Can you imagine how the world would be different if that had ever happened? But the Israelites couldn't even do it. It was too much for them, right? So this is difficult stuff. But the thing that struck me the most about the theology behind this week was so much of what I heard was people saying, well, I did the right thing. I paid my stuff back, and you ought to too, dadgummit. And while okay, I get that, right? But if you paid back a loan that you took in 1975, that's a very different situation than students find themselves in today. And I've tried to point that out in some of my writing this week. The cost of tuition has risen so much greater than the cost of wages. My mother came from a poor family in southern Oklahoma, cotton farmers. She went across the Red River to what's now Midwestern State University and worked her way through 4 years of college. She had no support from her family. They didn't have it to give. She worked as a secretary and she paid her way through college. That was in 1938 to 1942. Because it was possible then. It is not possible to work a minimum wage job today and pay your way through anything, right? You can barely live on minimum wage today. And we have to remember this so that our answers are shaped by love. You may still disagree with the policy. That's fine. But let's talk about that and do it in love for people whose experiences are not our experiences. I wrote in one piece this week about how our kids, incredibly fortunate, went to TCU, the second most expensive school in the state of Texas, next only to SMU, right down the street. Went to TCU on full academic scholarships. We didn't have to pay a dime in tuition for them.
What about Baylor?
Baylor's number 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We didn't have to pay tuition. But the cost of room and board and books and everything else was easily between $10,000 to $20,000 a year.
×2.
Right, ×2. So we're just average people, right? My kids had no trust fund to pull from, right? And so we did what we could, and there's a little bit of student loan debt still there. It's not huge, but it's what had to be done in that moment. It was not irresponsible. And I would say it was the loving thing to do as a parent to help make this education possible because it was the right place for them to be. And that's with a full academic scholarship, right? So you can apply that, you can filter that out and see all the different contexts in which this happens. There's a lot. Now, one of my friends who's a Baptist University administrator in another state jokingly sent me a text this week with a chart showing the amount of scholarship money his particular school gives. He said, since I know you think we're all the evil empire now, which is not what I said, right? Not what I said. What I saw missing in the conversation this week is 1 Corinthians 13. There is a problem here that we're not getting to the root of, and it is inequity in the system. Yes?
The new cardinal from San Diego has drawn flack at different times for saying, don't we owe these people $15 an hour?
Yeah, one of the things I'm most proud of during my tenure here at Wilshire is I worked with our personnel committee 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Even then, we created a base living wage for every person who works here, so that our lowest paid person on the payroll at Wilshire at the time was paid at least $15 an hour. Wow. Because the data showed that that's the minimum that you need to, have a decent living. There's all sorts of economics for this, and it's great to have that debate. But if we're just quoting Bible verses without love, we are clanging gongs and sounding cymbals. We're just making noise. And I saw a lot of people make noise this week. Just banging their cymbals so loud you couldn't see them. It was like deafening out of this. That's one illustration that I think comes out of this. But the other bigger issue is what the author Peter Enns, who I recommend, by the way, has a book titled The Sin of Certainty. The sin of certainty. And that's what Paul's talking about here as well. When you are so dadgum set in your beliefs that you are going to enforce them on everyone else come hell or high water, you close yourself to love. So this Thursday night, little commercial, I'm doing a webinar for some friends in Atlanta, Greg and Lynn McDonald, and they have a group called Embracing the Journey that is a resource group for LGBTQ parents primarily. And the topic I'm addressing is what I know now that I didn't know 6 years ago. Now you can do the math at Wilshire and figure out what 6 years ago is, right? What I know now that I didn't know 6 years ago. And I got up at 5 o'clock this morning. I couldn't sleep anymore, and I went to my computer and I wrote everything I'm going to say Thursday night. And part of that is I'm going to tell the story of my friend Lupe, who you heard me talk about here in the class. But this is my friend in the neighborhood whose husband died 2.5 weeks ago. His partner, 32 years. They've lived in our neighborhood 22 years. They know everybody up and down their street. As loving a couple as I've ever seen in my life. Bill was older than Lupe and had some health problems for the last few years, and particularly the last 2 years was pretty much homebound. And Lupe has been by his side devotedly during this, attending to his every need. And about 5 weeks ago, Bill was in his last hospital stay. He was in ICU, and it was determined that he needed to go home on hospice. And Lupe packed him up, put him in the car, took him home. The hospice workers came in, and they were trying to move in hospital beds and respirators and all this stuff that you do. And Lupe, if you met him, you would see him wag his finger at you. He said, "Oh no, we're not doing that. I promised my husband that he's going to die in his own bed, in our bed, the way he wants to, and it will be peaceful." And it was an adjustable bed so they could make it work, right? And he kept his promise. He kept his promise to Bill in this. And the night before Bill fell into a coma, he and Lupe sat up in that bed and talked from 10:30 at night till 5:30 in the morning, reviewing their life together, expressing their love for each other, and saying goodbye. And about 5:30 in the morning, Bill fell asleep and fell into a coma. And those were the last words he ever spoke. Friday, I went to Bill's funeral. It was at the Episcopal Church of the Transfiguration up on Hillcrest. Beautiful service. And amazing, I had worked with Lupe. I can't believe he did this. He got up and gave a eulogy himself. It was one of the most beautiful things it's easily one of the most beautiful eulogies I've ever heard in my life. It was brief, it was to the point, it was poignant. The love you could see coming through, right? And he talked about every morning, they prayed together. And there's a particular morning prayer from the Book of Common Prayer that they love, and they said together every morning, and Lupe led us all in saying that prayer at the service. Today is another day, Lord. Whatever it brings, help me accept it. It's a beautiful, brief prayer. There was not a dry eye in the house, right? At the end of the service, the bells started tolling. This is an Episcopal church. The bells started tolling, and we all walked in procession out of the sanctuary to the columbarium, just like walking through here. And we watched as Lupe knelt down in front of the niche and put the remains of his beloved husband in there, weeping copiously. I mean, heart-rending. I can hardly tell you the story right now. Heart-rending. And the words were spoken. We said the Lord's Prayer together. And I thought to myself, as I walked away, if this isn't love, I don't know what is. And I'm going to tell this story to parents Thursday night, because I want them to know that their kids are capable of love in the life that they have been dealt. And they, as parents, are capable of love in the life they have been dealt as well. Because love has got to trump theology at the end of the day. If your doctrine, if your theology will not allow you to love your own child, it's no good. Whatever the issue is, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be sexuality. If your theology says you've got to condemn your own child, you need to check your theology. And this is what Paul is saying here. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not keep record of wrongs. Love is not the strict parent saying, you've got to conform to me and my way and my theology. Love is not the strict spouse saying, you've got to do everything my way or we can't be together. Do you see the difference here? When love permeates everything, it makes everything so much better. And it makes it tolerable. It makes life the way God intended it to be, I think. I'm preaching now.
You go to we've all been to some funerals, some memorial services for people, and the minister did not know the deceased.
Right.
Or even if they did, they just get up there and they read the obituary and they explain all, and then they go into a basically last Sunday's sermon about soul winning, and
Right.
if you don't know the God that he loved, then you know this is what
Right.
you need to do, and it becomes a mini sermon on Revelation, say, and you just walk away going, was this for him or was this for his church service? You know, so you just don't have the love, or you do, you know. And the same thing also with a friend of mine, a running guy that I knew 20 years ago. Great guy, except he was so diligent, so militant, so just tough. And I thought, I'm not that friendly. I don't really like you very much. You know, I don't want to be around you because you're just, it's my way or the highway kind of thought. And now in the last year or two, I see he's a totally different person. He found out his son is gay, and he is wearing, you know, I support my son, you know, and all this, I'm a gay dad, and all this kind of stuff, which is confusing, I guess, for some people. But which way, you know, but, you know, it's a totally, now I like the heck out of this guy because now he's got such an empathy and a love for others. So now you see his love, now you see how he cares for others, and you're drawn to him.
So, Jim, it's a beautiful story, and you've got to ask, why is Paul going to all the trouble to tell the Corinthians about love? It's because he believes they can change. He believes they can live into the kind of love they're not known for right now. And if there is any gospel at all, it is the gospel of transformation, right? It is the hope that the most incorrigible of us can be changed, that the most unloving of us can love. Again, not to make this all about sexuality, but the story I'm going to use at the end of my presentation on Thursday is one from here. And I tell this story in my book. It's about a family that I knew very, very well. And a daughter of theirs, while in college, came home to tell her parents that she was bisexual, which is hard for anyone to understand. I mean, it's probably easier to understand transgender than bisexual for a lot of people. It just doesn't compute, right? And she came home, her very strict parents, very accomplished by the book parents. And her father, much to my surprise, listened to her, and he said, I don't understand, but I love you, and I'm going to learn. Love causes us to learn about other people. So when you heard Lynette a little bit ago talk about how difficult the past 4 or 5 years have been for her, we've got to understand that her life experience as a black person is so different than what we have known as any kind of white person, that the best thing we can do sometimes is shut up and learn, right? And love listens and learns. Love doesn't always dominate the conversation. That's what Paul's saying here. Otherwise, if you keep yammering, you're a clanging gong or a cymbal. What's our time?
It is
35.
10:35.
Oh, good. We've got about 5 more minutes. Someone else.
Go.
I keep thinking about the students at South Lake. Watching that on the news and reading about it, I had such a feeling of their love. And their
Yeah, those
standing
students who
up.
walked out at South Lake.
Uh-huh.
What they doing?
They walked out to protest some new school board policies. Namely, the school board has the right to approve every book that goes in the library.
Yeah,
And
Our transgender, somebody walked out, some school over.
Yeah, and this is all part of this same thing. Yeah, same thing as well. Yes, Ann?
In your experience now, over the last 6 years, I don't understand why people have such a hard time understanding why the whole sexual thing is at heart biological. It's not that somebody chooses this, it's just the way they're built.
So the question is, still trying to understand why people can't understand the biology of sexuality, sexual orientation, gender. There's a much deeper answer to this, I think. And it ties into science denial in general. We've talked about this before. God, I feel like a walking commercial today. This is the first chapter in my forthcoming book that was a product of lessons in this class, right? But if we can't tell the creation story correctly, we're not going to get the rest of the Bible right either. And one of the problems that we have within the church is we insist on making a literal interpretation of a story in Genesis that is not intended to be taken literally. And it puts us in a bind. So when you have people now, and I am not making this stuff up, y'all, this is for real. We have these wonderful images coming back from the Webb Space Telescope. I mean, spectacular images. And we have young Earth creationists trying to explain away how this really isn't what it is. I mean, they are so desperate to make everything conform to their narrow theology that they've got to come up with reasons to deny the plain evidence in front of them. It's like people saying, well, that guy wasn't really walking on the moon. They just did it in a studio somewhere.
My father, sorry, I'm interrupting.
Yes, fine.
My father worked on the lunar mission. We were in Florida for 7 years during that time. It was a really transformational.
So did you see the studio where this all was filmed?
Exactly. And I have some neighbors who were young people, and we were talking about that one point, and the woman in the couple said, I don't know, I've always kind of, and I like, honestly, Boeing would not have moved my father halfway across the country, and everybody else, because that's the way they did it back then, contractors would come down.
Right.
I've stepped outside my school and watched a rocket with, like, how many times did I do that? You
Right,
know?
right, yeah. So I think the root here is, again, being so committed to a theology that everything else goes away from that. And I'm just going to say, generally, that doesn't work out too well in any part of life, because it leads to a rigidity that is not acquainted with love. Yeah, hey.
One of my seminary professors said one time that it stuck with me from Romans, where it says, at the right time, God demonstrated God's love for us. And when was the right time? While we were sinners. So God, at the right time, when we were messed up, that's the time that God said, I love you. And I love that so much.
That's a great passage, isn't it?
And we have to, I think it's when we internalize that radical love that we're able to offer that same mercy and love for other people in their messed upness. Because, I mean, I certainly need that for myself.
Yeah. So let me just close with that, because I think this is a great reminder. We all know people who are lacking in mercy. And I'm thinking of people who, they love to gloat when someone else messes up. They love to say, look at that person. what a horrible person they are because they did this thing
Mm.
or that thing, right? That's not love. It's not Christianity, it is judgment, right? And Paul, despite whatever you love or hate Paul, right? There is a thread throughout his writings in the New Testament that is trying to bring contentious people into the light of love and into walking in the way of Christ. And the way of Christ is not judgment. It is not narrowness. It is love. And that's got to be the guiding principle, because when we love, we're open to learn. We're open to change. And I think that's what Paul, at root, in 1 Corinthians 13, is saying to the church at Corinth. I believe in you. I believe it is possible for you to overcome the dissensions and the problems that you have and to learn to live in a new way of love. And that's why I'm bothering to write you this letter. Let's close with that. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for these friends and the beauty of each person's story who's here and who's online. And I pray that you would pour out your love upon us and help us to share it with others. Where we are judgmental and narrow, open our eyes, Lord. Grant us your grace so that we are not clanging gongs and cymbals, but we are reminders of your redeeming love through Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, Charlene.
Yes.